There are a few ways that we can control access to our buckets and the objects that we store within our S3 buckets. So in this lesson, I'm going to walk you through IAM policies, bucket policies, and access control lists. And then in the next couple of lessons, we'll do hands-on to see these in action as well. So firstly, we have policies created in the Identity and Access Management Service. Now, these are identity-based policies, which means that they get associated with principles like users and roles. So with an IAM policy, we're directly applying the permissions that we want to assign to a principal to that principal. Or we might be applying them to a group by attaching a policy to a group and then adding a user into the group. We can specify what actions are allowed on what AWS resources. So we can say that you're allowed to perform specific actions on a specific bucket, for example. So with IAM policies, these are attached to users or groups or roles. And remember, with a group, you attach the policy to the group and then you add the user to the group and they will get the permissions assigned to that permissions policy. IAM policies are written in JSON using the AWS Access Policy language, and the principal element is not required in the policy. So when you see one of these JSON snippets of code, if it doesn't have a principal element in it, then that means that it could be an IAM policy that's used for S3 rather than a bucket policy. So next we have S3 bucket policies, and these are resource-based policies. So with a bucket policy, you're attaching it directly to an S3 bucket. They can only be attached to Amazon S3 buckets, and they also use the same access policy language. So it's still JSON, looks very much like the policies created at the identity level, but it's on a resource instead. So we might have an S3 bucket, we apply our bucket policy to it, and a bucket policy might look something like this. So note that there is a principal element here, which specifies the specific user we want to assign these permissions to. There's also a resource, and it specifies the bucket name. And of course, there's an action, which in this case is to the effect is allow, and the action is any S3 action. So a wildcard for S3 actions. So in this case, Paul will be able to put an object into that S3 bucket because he's allowed through the resource-based policy. Lastly, we have access control lists. These are really a legacy access control mechanism that predates identity and access management. AWS generally recommends that you try and use bucket policies or IAM policies rather than using ACLs. They can be attached to a bucket or directly to an object. So a bucket policy is always at the bucket level, whereas an ACL can be specified at the object level as well. There are limited options for grantees and permissions. We'll see this in the hands-on. It's not as powerful as using the access policy language. So when might you use these different access control mechanisms? You might use IAM policies for the following use cases, where you need to control access to AWS services other than S3, because you can then specify whatever permissions you want to whatever AWS service as well as the S3 bucket. You have numerous S3 buckets, each with different permissions requirements. So that means you're centrally controlling access to lots of different buckets using a single IAM policy, which is, centralizing the management and hopefully simplifying it. You might just prefer to keep access control policies in the IAM environment rather than using resource-based policies, which can be a bit harder to track. So you might want to use bucket policies if you want a simple way to grant cross-account access to S3 without using IAM roles. You can do that quite easily in a bucket policy. Your IAM policies might be reaching the size limits. There is a limit on the size of an IAM policy, so that might force you to use a bucket policy. Or you might just prefer to keep your access control policies in the S3 environment, and that could be down to separation of control within your organization. It's important to understand the authorization process, so let's work through the logic. The decision will always start at a deny, and then it evaluates the policies and looks for explicit denies. If there is an explicit deny, then that's the end. The final decision is deny. Next, if there isn't an explicit deny, we look for any allows. If there is an allow, then the decision is to allow. that's an explicit allow. If there isn't one, then the decision is deny. So that's basically the process for how authorization works. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to look at access control lists in a hands-on, and then we're going to look at IAM policies and bucket policies. In this lesson, we're going to have a look at access control lists on Amazon S3. In the S3 console, I'm going to click on my bucket here, DCT Cloud Storage. And under permissions, we can see the access control list just a bit further down here. Now, as you can see, there's a warning telling me I can't actually enable public access because it's disabled at the bucket level. So the first thing I want to do, because what I want to do as an exercise in this lesson is actually enable public access for my objects. So what I'll first need to do is unblock public access. Now let's just check the behavior at this stage. Let's go to one of our objects, copy the URL, and then put it into a browser window. And I get an access denied message, and that's completely expected. So what I need to do is go back up to my bucket level here, choose permissions, click on edit under block public access, and deselect this option, click on save, and then confirm. So now it's been confirmed. If we just scroll down to access control list, and let's edit the access control list. Now, note that there's a few different options here for the grantees. So a grantee is either the bucket owner, everyone, authenticated users, so anyone with an AWS account who has authenticated, or the S3 log delivery group for storing log files. So those are the only options. And then we have list and read and so on. So there's a few permissions and a few options for grantee. It's not hugely powerful like a bucket policy or an identity and access management policy. Now, this is the ACL at the bucket level. Remember, there's also an ACL at the object level. So I actually don't need to enable list access to my bucket to enable direct access to my object. So in fact, I'm going to leave this as it is. Let's click on Objects, choose one of my objects, go to Permissions, and then Edit here. Here I can enable read access for everyone, that's public access, for my object. I have to click on a checkbox here to understand what the impact is of this change, and then click on Save. Now, let's go back and refresh our screen. This time I can see the object, so it's now public. Now, another way you can achieve the same outcome is you can select an object, go to Actions, and Make Public. Click on Make Public, and that's done. So now if I go into this object, what you'll be able to see under the Permissions tab is that we've given read access, exactly the same thing. So just as with the other file, we should now be able to access this one, and we can see the image. So that's how you work with ACLs. Now let's just go back up to our bucket level and permissions. And another thing which is worth noting is the cross-account access. So let's click on Edit, and at the bottom here you can see access for other AWS accounts. This is a common use case for using an ACL. In this case, you can add the grantee, and you can enter the canonical ID, which is essentially a form of the account ID, and then give some basic permissions to anyone within that account. So that's all I want to show you for this lesson. One thing I am going to do is just go back up and put the block public access back on again. And now the configuration of our bucket is back to the way it was at the beginning of the lesson. Hi guys, in this lesson we're going to cover using bucket policies and user policies. So user policies are the IAM policies that we create and attach to our users. Now there are a couple of things that you're going to need to set up. Firstly, you need a second user account. I've got one called Paul. You can call this user whatever you want. Now that user will need management console access. At this stage, the user should not be in any groups, so effectively that user does not have any permissions. Now I've logged in as that user into a private window, and that means I'm logged into my main account with my own admin privileges in one window, and then in a private window or incognito window, I'm logged in as Paul. So Paul at this stage should not have any access. If you go into Amazon S3, what we should see is this. you don't have any permissions to list buckets. So the user has no privileges to S3 at this point in time. Now we also want to add a couple of folders and some files to our bucket. So I'm going to use the same bucket, DCT Cloud Storage. What we're going to do, we're going to create a folder. This one's going to be called Department. Just create the folder. Then we're going to create another one. This one's going to be called Confidential. I'm then going to go into the confidential folder, upload, add files, and I'm going to choose this file confidential report. So you can just create your own documents and call them whatever you want. So mine's called confidential report. It's a Word document. I'm going to upload that file, then close out of here, back up a level, choose the department folder, upload, add files, and this time I'm going to choose this company goals PDF. So that's the structure set up. Now let's have a look at the policies that we're going to use. In your course download, in the code directory, Amazon S3, you're going to have this file, user policies and bucket policies. And we've got some numbered items in here. So the first one is we're going to attach a user policy to our user, which allows that user to list buckets. So the privilege is S3 : list buckets, and the resource is any. So that means any AWS bucket that we have. It's a star, it's a wildcard. So what I'm going to simply do is copy this code here from the opening and the closing curly braces. Back in IAM, I'm going to choose my second user account. Mine's called Paul. And I'm going to add an inline policy. Click on the JSON tab, remove the existing code, and paste my new code in. Let's click on Review. I'm just going to call this Paul inline. And then let's create the policy. Now don't worry about this summary here. We're going to see what privileges this does assign to Paul. So we've attached that policy. Let's go over to the other browser window where Paul is logged in. So now I'm back logged in as Paul. Let's refresh my screen here, and I can now list the buckets. So you can see there's an access warning here of insufficient permissions. All I have here is the permission to list the bucket. So if I click on DCT Cloud Storage, I can't see any objects within the bucket. I can only list at the bucket level. So let's go to the next policy. It says see root level bucket items, user policy. So what does this one do? So here we have the list all my buckets and get bucket location privileges. We then have the S3 list bucket, which is an allow for a specific bucket name. In this case, it was DCT policy test. Now I need to change that for my bucket. So make sure you change this value here. Now the condition is that the string equals a prefix and a delimiter of /. So what this should do is allow us to see the items within the bucket. So let's copy all of this code to our clipboards, and then back logged in as my main user account, I'm going to edit this policy, click on JSON, delete all the code, and paste this in. Now remember, I do need to change my bucket name here. So back on S3, with my bucket selected, I'm going to go to Properties and ARN. I can copy that to my clipboard. Come back and I can paste that in. So I can replace the entire ARN here. And let's save this policy. Now let's go back over to Paul. Back logged in as Paul, I'm trying to look at the objects within my bucket here. Let's click on the refresh. And you see that now I can actually see these objects. Can I download an object? Let's have a look. And I get an access is denied. What about going in and looking at items in confidential? Well, now I don't have permissions. So we're getting quite granular here in the permissions we're assigning to this user. Now let's move on to the next policy. This is to view the department folder contents. Now what you may notice is we've got a lot of the permissions here that we had in the previous policy, and then we have some additional permissions at the bottom here. So here we have the list bucket. We again need to replace our ARN. So let me paste my new ARN in. It also has to be back up here. So make sure you do that. Make sure you change your ARN. And what this last policy statement here is going to do is allow us access to the department folder /star. So anything within the department folder. So let's go and copy all of this code. I'm again going to edit the policy, click on JSON, delete everything out, paste this in, Just as a reminder, make sure you've got the correct ARN for your bucket, and then let's review policy and save. So back logged in as Paul, let's refresh, but I'm trying to look in the confidential folder here, and we didn't give those permissions, so I'm not getting access. Let's come back up to the bucket level, try department, and we can see. So we've now enabled this user to see right down to the objects within the department folder. But as you saw before, we haven't given any permissions for uploading or deleting objects yet. So the next policy here is still a user policy, and the first 3 of these sections are the same as before. And then the very last one at the bottom here allows the S3 get object and S3 put object actions. Now I'm going to go out to my previous policy, copy this ARN. Let's come down. There's going to be multiple places we need to put this. As you can see, it's highlighted the 3 places. So let's change in all 3 of these locations. And be careful with the last one. You want to keep the /department/star. So that's it. I should be able to copy this code. Let's again edit our policy, go to JSON, delete this out, put our new code in, review, and save. So back in the department folder, let's now see if we can download our object. And that works. I can see my file downloading. And I should also be able to upload objects because I gave the permission to put object. So let's just choose any file and try and upload. And that's also a success. The last policy is a bucket policy. And we need to use this in combination with policy 2 above. Now, let's just copy our ARN again. So remember the ARN up to the name of the bucket. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it over the ARN in my resource section of my bucket policy. Then we need to use user policy 2. So we need to go back up to policy 2. And I remember I didn't actually update this one in my file. So I'm going to update my ARN here as well. Copy this code. We're going to edit Paul's policy again, paste that in, and this will give the user the list level at the top of the bucket again. So let's just save those changes. If we come back to Paul, who's trying to look in the department folder and refresh, we should find that soon we get denied access. And there we go. That took a couple of refreshes. It can sometimes take a bit of time. So what about at the bucket level here? And yes, we can see the objects at this level. Now, what if we go into the confidential folder? Well, here we certainly don't have permissions because we can only see at the level above. So coming back to the code, now we need to use the bucket policy. And the bucket policy is going to allow the specific user. So you're going to need to go and get the ARN of your user, which you can find inside the user account here. Just copy the ARN to your clipboard and then paste that in. So this principle will be allowed the action S3 star, so any S3 action on the resource DCT Cloud Storage, so our bucket name, and then the prefix is under a condition. So the condition is limiting this access. So any S3 action, but only on this prefix, which is the confidential folder, and then /star, which means the objects within the folder. The /star indicates that the privileges are assigned to the objects within the folder as well. So let's copy all of this, and now we're going to go and add a bucket policy. So back in S3, I'm in my bucket here, and under permissions, let's scroll down a little way and click on edit next to bucket policy, and we're going to paste our policy in. And just in case you haven't updated your ARN, you can get it easily here as well. You can copy it and then paste it in and make sure you've got the correct ARN. So let's save these changes. Come back to Paul. Let's click on refresh. And now we have our access again, and we now have full permissions to the confidential folder only. So that's how we work with user policies as well as bucket policies. And as you can see, we can actually use them together as well.